The divorce papers were just a distraction. She didn't want to leave me. She wanted to erase me from the wreckage of the illegal scheme that built her empire. I was her anchor, but when the authorities finally came knocking, I realized she had already turned me into the perfect scapegoat to save her own skin. They say that behind every successful man is a great woman, but they never tell you what happens when the roles are reversed. When the woman reaches the summit and decides the man who carried her luggage is nothing but dead weight. For 10 years, I was the silent foundation of Sarah's empire. I was the one who worked double shifts at the warehouse so she could finish her MBA. I was the one who polished her presentation decks at 3 a.m. while she slept. And I was the one who listened to her weep over every failed interview, every condescending manager, and every closed door. I believed in her when she was just a dreamer in a studio apartment with a leaking roof. When she finally landed that CEO role at the tech firm, I thought we had made it. I thought we were a team. The shift didn't happen overnight. It was a slow, agonizing erosion. It started with the subtle shifts in her tone, the way she would check her watch while I was telling her about my day, the way she began to prioritize corporate galas over our anniversary dinners, and the way she started looking at me as if I were a piece of furniture she had outgrown. I was the reminder of her lesser days, the witness to the struggle she now wanted to pretend never existed. I was the anchor, and to a woman trying to reach stratospheric heights, an anchor feels a lot like an obstacle. 2 months ago, she came home, but she didn't come to me. She walked past me, her designer heels clicking against the hardwood like the countdown of a clock. She didn't mention the promotion rumors or the quarterly earnings. She simply sat at the dining room table, placed a thick cream-colored envelope on the mahogany surface, and looked through me. Her eyes, which used to soften at the mere sound of my key in the lock, were now cold, calculating, and detached. "I've outgrown this, Mark," she said, her voice devoid of any warmth. "We're in different worlds now. I need someone who understands the complexity of my life, not someone who's constantly trying to catch up to it." I stared at the envelope. It was a divorce filing. The irony was suffocating. I had sold my own car, taken out high-interest loans, and sacrificed my own professional trajectory to ensure she had the financial and emotional breathing room to conquer the business world. I had acted as her consultant, her confidant, and her investor, investing everything I had into her, banking on a future that she was now liquidating. I tried to talk to her, to remind her of the nights we spent eating ramen on the floor, dreaming of the day we could finally breathe. But she just laughed, a bitter, hollow sound that made my skin crawl. She had rewritten our history. In her version, she had done it all alone. I was no longer the partner. I was the charity case she had finally decided to cut loose. "Don't make this difficult," she said, tapping her fingers against the table. "I have the best lawyers in the city. You'll get a fair settlement, and you can go back to whatever quiet little life you had before you met me." I didn't argue. I didn't shout. I just watched her, noting the way she had groomed herself to be untouchable. She was a titan of industry now, polished and ruthless. She felt invincible. She thought she knew every card I held. She thought the only things I knew were her insecurities and her early failures. What she didn't realize was that I had spent the last decade in the trenches with her, and while she was busy building the facade of a perfect ethical corporation, I was the one who had been quietly managing the irregularities she didn't want to see. I walked out of the house that night, leaving the envelope where it lay. I didn't need to read it. I already knew the terms. She wanted a clean break, a sanitized exit. She wanted to erase me from her narrative completely. But she had made one fatal error. She had underestimated the person who knew exactly where all the skeletons were buried. As I sat in my old beat-up sedan in the pouring rain, my phone buzzed. It was an anonymous notification from my cloud drive, a folder I hadn't opened in years. It was a collection of files, emails, and financial ledgers that I had kept purely for protection, just in case the corporate world ever turned against her. I never intended to use them. I kept them as a safety net, a way to prove that we were legitimate if anyone ever poked too hard into her company's rapid growth. But as I scrolled through the decrypted files, my blood ran cold. I realized why she was so desperate to cut ties. It wasn't just about me being below her station. It was about the massive illegal operation that had been funding her company's explosive success, an operation she had sanctioned, and one that was about to be investigated by a high-level internal team. She hadn't just filed for divorce, she was distancing herself from the ship before it sank, and she was planning to frame me as the one who handled the dirty work. I looked at the house one last time, the lights glowing with an expensive, artificial warmth. She wasn't just leaving me, she was handing me a life-altering frame-up to save her own skin. My phone buzzed again. This time, it was an alert from the local news. A headline flashed across the screen. Tech giant under investigation for massive financial fraud and association with shadowy networks. I realized then that she hadn't served me divorce papers because she had outgrown me. She served them because she was about to call the authorities and tell them I was the mastermind behind the entire illegal scheme, hoping to pin a major career-ending criminal accusation on me while she walked away as the victimized CEO. As I started the engine, my phone rang. It was her. I answered, and before she could speak, I heard the sound of sirens in the distance, getting closer to my location. She whispered, "I hope you enjoy your new life in a cage, Mark. You were always just a temporary expense." The line went dead, leaving me with nothing but the rhythmic hum of my engine and the encroaching wail of sirens. My heart was slamming against my ribs like a trapped bird. She hadn't just filed for divorce, she had initiated a calculated, cold-blooded execution of my character. By the time the blue and red lights began to dance across my windshield, I knew exactly what was happening. She had already contacted the authorities, painting me as the architect of the organized scheme that had bankrolled her ascent. To the world, she was the brilliant, self-made visionary. To the law, I was now the convenient scapegoat, the shadowy figure behind the curtain. I threw the car into reverse just as two black SUVs flanked the exit of my apartment complex. I didn't panic, not yet. Panic was a luxury I couldn't afford. I had spent years watching Sarah navigate high-stakes negotiations. I knew how she thought. If she was going to frame me, she needed evidence. And the evidence she had planted wouldn't be in the house. That was too obvious. It would be in the off-site accounts I had helped her set up years ago, under names that trace back to my own digital footprint. I sped through the rain-slicked streets, my mind racing through the labyrinth of the illegal financial networks she had exploited. Every single transaction had been routed through dummy corporations, and in her final act of betrayal, she'd moved the master keys to those accounts into a secure server linked directly to my personal identity. She wasn't just planning to divorce me, she was planning to bury me under a mountain of heavy accusations that would ensure I spent decades behind bars, while she stood on a pedestal, acting as the whistleblower who exposed her own rogue husband. I ducked into a parking garage, ditching the car in the darkest corner. My hands were shaking as I pulled out my laptop. I needed to access the internal audit logs, the ones I had secretly encrypted the day I realized her morality was a fluctuating currency. As I bypassed the final layer of security, the screen glowed with the cold, hard truth. There it was, a series of transfers totaling millions, all tagged with my biometric digital signature, specifically designed to trigger an automatic alert to the Internal Safety and Compliance Office. She hadn't just set the stage, she'd already pulled the trigger. I saw the timestamp on the most recent file, 20 minutes ago. She had logged in as me. "You think you're so smart, Sarah," I whispered into the dark, empty garage. "But you forgot that I'm the one who coded the security protocol for the entire infrastructure." I began to work, my fingers flying across the keys. If I couldn't wipe my digital footprint, I would instead create a trail that led directly to her private server, the one she thought was air-gapped from the rest of the company. I was stripping away the layers of her clean reputation, exposing the fact that she had been the one approving the movement of the packets with prohibited substances and laundering the funds. Every second I worked, I felt the phantom presence of the law behind me. I knew the Internal Investigative Unit was likely already at our front door, ready to find whatever proof she had planted. Suddenly, my screen flickered. A remote access prompt popped up. Someone was trying to override my session. It was her. She was watching, or someone she hired was tracking my IP address in real time. I slammed the laptop shut just as the heavy steel doors of the parking garage groaned open. Headlights swept the concrete, blindingly bright. They had found the car. I abandoned the laptop in the back seat, grabbed my go bag, and bolted toward the stairwell. I could hear shouts, men in tactical gear, their voices echoing off the concrete. They weren't just police. They were private security detail, her personal cleanup crew, disguised in the dark to make sure I never made it to a courtroom where I could tell my side of the story. I climbed, my lungs burning, moving up the concrete spine of the building toward the rooftop. I burst onto the roof, the cold wind hitting my face. I was trapped. It was a 12-story drop to the alleyway below. The door behind me swung open, and the beam of a high-intensity flashlight cut through the dark, pinning me to the edge of the parapet. I turned, shielding my eyes. There, standing behind the men, was Sarah. She looked immaculate, her coat billowing in the wind, a look of serene, victorious hatred on her face. "You really should have taken the settlement, Mark," she said, her voice amplified by the wind, cold and hollow. "It would have been so much quieter for you." She gestured to the men, who began to advance, their hands moving to their belts, revealing that they weren't here to arrest me. They were here to silence me. As the men closed in, I realized the full extent of her power. She had bought the system. She hadn't just prepared for a legal battle. She had prepared for a total eradication. As one of the men reached out to grab my collar, I stepped backward, right to the very edge of the abyss, my heel catching on a loose piece of gravel. Sarah stepped forward, her eyes narrowing as she looked at me with genuine curiosity, as if she were watching an experiment reach its conclusion. "Any last words before the evidence is found on your body?" she asked. I smiled, a jagged, broken grin, and pulled a small, ruggedized flash drive from my pocket, the one thing she'd forgotten to check for during our last argument. "You forgot one thing, Sarah. I didn't just back up the files. I set a dead man's switch. If I don't check in with the server in the next 60 seconds, every single detail of your empire gets emailed to the national news desks, the internal audit board, and the lead prosecutor for the district." Her face went pale, her composure shattering for the first time in years. "You're lying," she hissed. "Check your phone," I countered. The countdown has already started. As she fumbled for her phone, her eyes widening in horror at the notification flashing on her screen, the men lunged. I took a breath, looked at the drop, and realized I had only one way out. As I leaned back, gravity taking hold, I heard the sirens finally reach the street below. But they weren't for me. They were for the building. And as I plummeted into the darkness, I saw her scream, not in triumph, but in absolute total panic. The sensation of falling was not the cinematic blur people talk about. It was a violent, suffocating rush of cold air and terror. I hit the industrial waste container in the alleyway with a bone-jarring thud, the metal buckling under my weight. The breath was knocked out of me, my vision swimming in jagged shards of gray and white. I didn't wait to check for broken bones. Adrenaline, sharp and acidic, flooded my system, overriding the agony in my shoulder and side. I scrambled out of the bin, smelling of rotting refuse and wet cardboard, and ducked into the shadows just as the heavy thud of boots hit the roof above. They weren't looking for a body to arrest, they were looking for a body to hide. I could hear their radios crackling, their voices distorted and urgent. They were already calling in to report a tragic accident, a fall from the heights after an interrogation gone wrong. I moved through the labyrinth of the city's back alleys, avoiding the main thoroughfares where cameras were as common as streetlights. My phone was dead, shattered in the drop, but I had one destination left, the one place she never thought I'd dare go. I reached the small, unmarked office of an old friend, a journalist who had been disgraced years ago for digging too deep into the very tech firm Sarah now commanded. I pounded on the metal door until the latch clicked. When Elias opened it, he looked at my bloodied clothes and ruined face, his expression shifting from annoyance to pure electric shock. I didn't give him a chance to ask questions. I pulled the second copy of the flash drive from the lining of my jacket and slammed it onto his desk. "She's burning it all down, Elias," I gasped, collapsing into his threadbare office chair. "She's not just laundering money, she's orchestrating a purge. Everyone who knows the origin of her capital is being marked for termination." Elias plugged the drive into a localized air-gap terminal. As the files began to load, his face turned the color of ash. He wasn't just looking at bank statements. He was looking at the communication logs between Sarah and the radical network she had been funding to sabotage her competitors' infrastructure. It wasn't just corporate fraud anymore. It was a conspiracy involving prohibited items and a dangerous reach into local government. Sarah wasn't just a CEO. She was the silent patron of an organized scheme that had destabilized the entire sector. "Mark, this is a death sentence," he whispered, his eyes glued to the screen. "If you release this, you aren't just taking her down. You're inviting a war. These people don't just sue, they make people disappear. She's not working alone. She's a puppet for someone much, much higher up." As he spoke, the lights in the office flickered and died. A heavy, unnatural silence descended over the building. Then the rhythmic, metallic sound of a deadbolt sliding back echoed through the hallway. Someone was here, not the police. These were professionals, the kind that cleaned up messes before the news could ever catch wind of them. "We have to go," I whispered, reaching for my bag, but the door handle began to turn slowly. Elias looked at the terminal, then at me. "The upload is at 80%. If I unplug it now, it's gone. If I keep it going, they'll have enough time to reach us." I grabbed a heavy fire extinguisher from the corner and stood by the door, my muscles screaming in protest. The door creaked open, revealing not a face but a laser sight dancing across the wall, seeking a target. I didn't hesitate. I swung the extinguisher with every ounce of my remaining strength, catching the silhouette in the doorway and sending him sprawling into the hall. I slammed the door shut and jammed a chair under the knob. 60%, Elias shouted, his fingers dancing across the keys. Outside, the muffled sounds of a struggle began. They were coming through the wall. I saw the drywall begin to disintegrate under the impact of something heavy, a sledgehammer, or worse. I looked at Elias, who was sweating profusely, his eyes wide with the realization that we were trapped in a room with no second exit. 40%, he yelled. The wall suddenly exploded inward, a cloud of white dust filling the room. Through the haze, a figure emerged, weapon leveled at my chest. Not a typical police sidearm, but something far more specialized. It was Sarah's head of security, a man I had personally hired years ago, now standing there with a cold, hollow look in his eyes. "Sarah sends her regards," he said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "She says thank you for the final lesson in loyalty." He pulled the trigger, but there was no sound, just a sharp, pressurized hiss. A dart whistled past my ear, embedding itself in the wall behind me. I dove behind the desk as the room erupted in chaos. Elias screamed, "Done! It's live!" At that exact moment, the windows shattered. Not from the outside, but from the sheer concussion of an explosion downstairs. The floor beneath us shuddered, and the entire building began to tilt. We were being taken down, literally and figuratively, by an outside force that didn't care if we were in the room or not. I scrambled toward the window, looking down at the street. Below, a fleet of unmarked vehicles had swarmed the block. It wasn't the police. It was the Internal Safety and Compliance Office, and they weren't here to negotiate. They were here for a total, scorched earth extraction. As the ceiling began to collapse, the man in the doorway hesitated, his own radio blaring with the sound of a panic-stricken voice, Sarah's. She was screaming into the line, "Cancel it! It's too late! The servers have already leaked! Just get out of there!" The shooter turned to run, but the floor gave way, swallowing him into the darkness of the lower level. Elias grabbed my arm, his face frantic. "We have to jump! The building is coming down!" As we stood on the precipice of the broken window, looking down at the carnage unfolding in the street, I saw a black sedan screech to a halt. The rear door opened, and there she was, Sarah, watching the building fall with a look of absolute soul-crushing defeat. She looked up, locked eyes with me through the smoke and debris, and in that moment, I saw the mask finally crack. She wasn't just losing her empire. She was realizing that the man she had tried to erase was the only one who could have saved her from the monsters she had invited into her life. Then, the entire floor beneath us groaned and gave way. As we plunged toward the debris-filled alley, the last thing I saw was Sarah being forcibly dragged into her car by her own security, not to escape, but to be taken to a place where no CEO could ever survive. We were falling again, and this time there was no safety net. The fall was shorter this time, cushioned by the collapse of the mezzanine floor beneath us. We landed in a heap of splintered wood, drywall, and electrical conduit, the air thick with the metallic tang of ozone and settling dust. For a heartbeat, there was silence, the kind of ringing, heavy stillness that follows a bomb blast. Then the sirens surged to a deafening roar, drowning out the groans of the shifting building. I pushed a heavy beam off my legs, the sharp sting of debris in my eyes, making it impossible to see for a moment. "Elias!" I choked out, my voice sounding like gravel hitting a tin roof. There was no answer. I crawled forward, my hands finding only wreckage. The office was gone, replaced by a jagged hole that dropped straight into the building's utility basement. I scrambled to the edge, peering down into the darkness. Far below, orange flames licked at the foundation, casting long, dancing shadows against the ruins. Elias was nowhere to be seen, but lying on a piece of debris near the edge was the flash drive, its tiny LED light blinking rhythmically, mocking the chaos around us. I snatched it up, my heart hammering against my ribs. I had the truth, but I was currently pinned under a literal mountain of concrete and steel, and the sounds of tactical boots hitting the pavement outside suggested the cleanup had officially transitioned into a full-scale containment operation. This wasn't just a police investigation anymore. The silence of the night was shattered by the rhythmic thumping of a helicopter hovering above, its spotlight slicing through the dust like a blade. I scrambled away from the edge, navigating the treacherous maze of twisted rebar and collapsed partitions. I needed a way out, but every hallway was a tomb of smoke and debris. As I turned a corner, a beam of light caught me square in the chest. I froze, expecting the worst, but the figure behind the light wasn't one of Sarah's hounds. It was a man in an unmarked vest, clean, precise, and entirely devoid of the desperation that defined the last few hours. "Don't move," the man said, his voice flat and professional. "We've been waiting for you to come to this conclusion, Mark." "Who the hell are you?" I demanded, shielding my eyes. "Internal security review," he replied, gesturing for me to follow him through a narrow, precarious breach in the wall. "Your wife's reach was vast, but her oversight was sloppy. She thought she was the one running the game, but she was merely a node in a much larger, more dangerous network. We've been tracking her assets for 3 years. We just needed someone on the inside to finally force her hand." My blood ran cold. "You let her build this? You let her involve me in this? You stood by while she dragged me into a situation that could have cost me everything?" "We needed the ledger," the man said, his eyes hard. "And we needed you to finish the decryption process. You did the heavy lifting, Mark. We're just here for the final collection." He wasn't here to save me. He was here to finish the harvest. I realized then that my life had been a pawn in a game I hadn't even known was being played. Sarah was the CEO, but she was just as expendable to these people as I was. I felt the weight of the flash drive in my pocket, the only real leverage I had left in this twisted world. "The files are already uploaded," I lied, my voice steadying. "If I don't input a secondary code in the next 5 minutes, the entire database is pushed to every major international news agency. If I go down, the world wakes up to the truth about your organization, not just hers." The man paused, his eyes narrowing. He didn't know if I was bluffing, and in that split second of uncertainty, I saw my opening. I didn't wait for him to process the threat. I kicked a stack of unstable masonry toward him and dived into the dark chute of a trash incinerator shaft I had spotted just behind him. I slid down the cold metal interior, my descent ending with a jarring impact in the basement's refuse collection point. I wasn't out yet, but I was beneath the building's perimeter. I crawled toward a ventilation grate, wrenching it open with my bare, bleeding hands. I scrambled out into the damp, cold air of the city sewer system, the sound of the burning building a dull roar above me. I ran until my lungs burned like fire, following the map of the city's underbelly in my head, heading toward the only place she'd never look, the basement of our old first apartment where I had hidden a secondary burner phone and a small stash of emergency cash. I finally kicked open the basement grate of that old, dilapidated building and collapsed onto the concrete floor. The air was stale, smelling of wet dust and forgotten memories. I reached into the hollowed-out baseboard where I'd hidden the phone years ago, my fingers trembling as I pulled it out. It buzzed instantly. A single text message from an unknown number. "I'm outside. If you want to survive, open the door. If you want to die for a woman who never loved you, stay where you are." I walked to the door and peered through the peephole. My heart stopped. It wasn't Sarah's security, and it wasn't the internal review team. It was Sarah herself, standing there in the middle of the rain looking like a ghost. Her designer coat was torn, her hair matted with soot, and she was holding a heavy black handgun at her side, pointed toward the ground. She wasn't here to kill me. She was trembling. "Mark," she whispered, her voice cracking. "They're coming for both of us, not to jail, to erase us. I have the car keys. We have exactly 60 seconds before they track the signal from the building." I looked at the door, then back at the flash drive. The woman who had tried to bury me was now standing on my doorstep, begging for help. I reached for the lock, but before I could turn it, the entire street outside lit up with the blinding, focused beams of a dozen high-powered tactical lights, and the sound of dozens of boots hitting the pavement silenced the rain. They had found us, both of us. The street outside erupted in a chaotic symphony of barked orders and the rhythmic, metallic clatter of professional-grade weaponry. Sarah wasn't a CEO anymore. She was a frightened, broken woman huddled against the rotting wood of my basement door. As the tactical lights swept across the brickwork, I looked at her, then down at the flash drive. The logic of our life together, the lies, the sacrifices, the betrayals, boiled down to this singular final heartbeat. I unlocked the door, and she stumbled in, gasping for air. Her expensive shoes were ruined, her eyes wide with a terror I had never seen in all our years. She gripped my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "They don't want the company, Mark. They want the records of the internal agency itself. You have the only copy of the shadow ledger, and that makes us the most dangerous people on the planet." Outside, a megaphone crackled. "Mark, Sarah, step out with your hands visible. Do not make this harder than it needs to be." It was the same voice from the office. They weren't law enforcement. They were the architects of the illegal scheme, and they were here to burn the evidence, starting with us. I looked at the small room, the place where we had started a decade ago, with nothing but a mattress and a dream. I reached into the floorboard and pulled out the old laptop I'd kept as a backup. "If we give them the drive, they'll kill us," I said, my voice eerily calm. "If we don't, they'll kill us." Sarah looked at me, a flicker of the woman I once knew returning to her eyes. "Then we don't give them the drive. We send it, all of it, to every server, every news desk, and every secure line we can find. We make the information so toxic that even they can't survive the fallout." It was a suicide mission for our reputations, but it was the only way to survive the night. I slammed the drive into the port. As the progress bar crawled forward, Sarah stood by the door, watching the shadows of the men as they surrounded the building. She didn't have her weapon raised. She was waiting for my signal. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the thumping of a helicopter circling above. "I wanted to be someone. I wanted to be safe. I thought by cutting you out, I could protect you from what I was doing. I was so arrogant." "You were a fool," I replied, my eyes fixed on the screen. "But you're my fool. The progress bar hit 99%. Outside, the front door of the building was kicked in, the wood splintering with a deafening crack. Heavy boots stomped into the hallway above. We had seconds. 100%, I yelled, hitting enter. The entire world shifted. Across the globe, the files began to dump into the public record. Within seconds, the tactical team outside stopped moving. Their radios erupted in a cacophony of frantic, panicked voices. The man leading the team, the one who had tracked us, stopped dead in his tracks just outside our basement door. His phone began to vibrate, then his radio, then the entire block seemed to hum with the sudden, violent response of the internet waking up to the truth. The tactical lights blinked off. The helicopters pivoted away, abandoning the scene. The men in the hall didn't rush us. They retreated, knowing their identities had just been beamed to every intelligence agency on the planet. The secret was out, and the power dynamic had inverted in the span of a breath. Sarah slumped against the wall, sliding down to the floor. We sat there in the silence, listening to the fading sound of engines as the cleanup crew scrambled to save themselves rather than finish the job. We had lost everything, the money, the company, the status, but for the first time in years, the air in the room felt breathable. We were broke, we were targets, and our names would likely be dragged through the mud of every court in the country. But we were alive. The flash drive lay on the floor, empty. The empire Sarah had built was officially a crater, and the illegal network that had backed it was now being torn apart by the very agencies it had tried to corrupt. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice trembling. I looked at her, really looked at her, past the designer clothes and the CEO persona, and saw the person I had helped build, and who had ultimately helped destroy me. We were at the beginning again, but this time, the playing field was level. "We walk out," I said, standing up and offering her my hand. "We tell the truth, we face the music, and we never, ever build another empire on a foundation of sand." As we walked out into the rain, the dawn was beginning to break over the city. A squad of real federal agents was waiting at the perimeter, but they weren't aiming their weapons. They were there to secure the scene, and for the first time in a decade, the fear in my gut began to dissipate. We had lost our fortune, but we had reclaimed our lives. I pulled Sarah close, and as the agents approached, I knew that whatever punishment came, we were finally truly in it together. The divorce wasn't happening. The battle had forged something else entirely, a shared survival that was stronger and far more honest than anything we had ever known before.